So we're starting chapter 2, which is exciting. Of course, it's always exciting to start a new chapter. And what we walked away from with chapter 1 was, as Sarah was just saying, the enormous preciousness of the Jew, how special we are, how precious we are, how each one of us is a piece of God in this world. And in chapter 1, we explained that a foundational point of the chapter was the concept that we have two separate souls. We have an animal soul, accompanied by, or more correctly, guided and directed by, led by the evil inclination. And then we have the godly soul. And what we were doing until now, really at the end of chapter 1, was understanding the animal soul. And now, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, we're going to spend 4 chapters on the godly soul. When we're looking at the godly soul, we're really looking at ourselves. Because in essence, that's what we are. We're not in essence an animal soul. We're in essence a godly soul. So let's understand this godly soul, who we really, really are. So chapter 2. V'nefesh Hashem b'Yisrael chelek Eloka mimal mamish. And the second soul in the Jew is a portion from God above, literally. So Nefesh Hashem is the second soul. Why are we calling this the second soul? Because as we discussed at length in chapter 1, it comes into the body second, right? You're born with the animal soul. The animal soul gets a head start to like put down its roots in you, to anchor itself, because we said the godly soul is so much more powerful. If they both came at the same time, it would just be a knockout victory, which sounds nice, but it's not the point. So the second soul, be Israel in the Jew. Because as we explained at length, at the very end of chapter 1, only a Jew has a godly soul. A non-Jew has an animal soul. And everything in this world has soul. Even the most inanimate object has soul. Soul meaning that godliness that's vivifying it. And a non-Jew has a complete structure of an animal soul. Very different, as we explained at length, from the Jew's animal soul, but a complete animal soul. But only exclusively the Jew has the godly soul. So Nefesh Hashem is be Yisrael. So let us define that animal soul. How are we defining it? Chelek Eloka mimal mamish. A portion of God from above, literally. Now that phrase, Chelek Eloka mimal, a portion from God above, is actually a quotation. It's from Eov, from Job. And this is the definition of a soul, a piece of God above. The Alter Rebbe adds the word mamish. Mamish means tangibly, like we would say mamushus, something that has substance. And simply the Alter Rebbe is saying, this is not exaggeration. It might sound like an exaggeration. Oh, a piece of God above. Oh yeah, like, this is a skyscraper, right? It's so tall, it reaches the sky. The giants are so tall, they reach the sky. This is so powerful, blah, blah, blah. The soul is a piece of God above. No, the Alter Rebbe is saying, this is literal. This is not exaggerated. This is not to emphasize the point for dramatic effect. This is literally the reality. The godly soul is a piece, chelek. It's a piece of God from above. Now, those two terms, mimal and mamish, are actually almost like opposites. Mimal means from above, so that's like spiritual. And mamish means it's tangible, it's physical. And that's the idea of the soul. Mimal, mamish. From above, so high, so spiritual, and can come all the way down to affect the concrete physical reality of this world. And we're told it's a chelek, it's a piece of God. Chelek Eloka, which means the soul is different than everything else in creation, which means the Jew is different than everything else in creation, because the Jew is defined by a godly soul. It's not our features, it's not our characteristics, it's not our talents. What defines a Jew is a godly soul. You have a Jew who doesn't look like a Jew, he's not talking like a Jew, he doesn't know the lingo of the Jew, he doesn't know the culture of the Jew, he has a godly soul, he's a Jew. And conversely, someone that has everything else but doesn't have a godly soul is not a Jew. A Jew is a godly soul. A godly soul is given and maintained within the fetus if there's a Jewish mother. If there's no Jewish mother, the only way a person has a godly soul is if they go through a kosher conversion. So a kosher conversion or a Jewish mother guarantees a godly soul, and nothing else gives a godly soul but that. And that is the defining character of the Jew. The defining quality is a godly soul. Nothing else. We can think of lots of things that, oh, all Jews or most Jews or Jews should, right? We're discussing at the end of last chapter, compassion and kindness, the Jewish traits. Yes, those are very Jewish traits. But that's not the definition of a Jew. The definition of a Jew is possessing a godly soul. And we're told this is a chelik elokah, a peace of God from above. And we mean that term peace very, very literally. A peace meaning possessing all the qualities of the original, of the origin point. Like concept, the metaphor given, if you took a piece of, you took an apple, you take a whole apple, start with a whole apple, and you cut it in 10,000 pieces, you're giving me something so small, so minuscule, I wouldn't know what it is. It's so tiny, I have no way of defining it as apple. I wouldn't know. But if I put it on my tongue and I taste that little, tiny shred, I'm like, apple. Because the taste is completely apple. So it's tiny, but it's completely apple. And that's like a metaphor for the Jewish soul. Meaning, when we're saying the Jewish soul is a piece of God, does that mean we're the creator? No, but we're not creation either. Actually, somebody once came to the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's referred to as a Tzemach Tzedek, an apostate, a kofar. And in a very mocking way, he said to the Rebbe, well, if God is so great and can do anything, can God create another God? Like, got you there, right? And the Tzemach Tzedek responded, he not only can, he did. He created Jews. Whoa. What is the Rebbe saying? The Rebbe is saying, every Jew inside of himself, in his core, is a piece of God. And this is a really important thing to understand because, of course, the more we learn Hasidic thought, and some of you have been learning this for years and years and years, and you're so knowledgeable, everything is God. If it wasn't God, it wouldn't exist, right? Ein od milvado. There's nothing but God. That's such a popular expression nowadays in all circles. There's nothing but God. What do you mean there's nothing but God? There's this, whatever it is, little piece of something here, right? Some outlet plug device. There's this. Is this God? Ain't od milvado. But is this God? This is a vivification of godly energy. Yes, this godly energy looks different than this godly energy. But both of these, in their core, are godly energy. If they weren't, they wouldn't be. And so to the Jew, no. Because the Jew, unlike the pencil, unlike this, whatever, plug, the Jew is not a vivification from godliness. The Jew is a piece of God. The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, referred to as the Rebbe Rashab, stated that the essence of the soul comes from the essence of God himself. Every single Jew, even the ones that you don't particularly like or don't seem especially tuned in and expressive of their godly energy, every single Jew, the core of his soul is not only God energy, it's from the God's essence. That's the power of the soul. And again, mimal, from above, mamish, to go all the way down. The soul is so high, a piece of God, the core of soul from the core of God. To have that energy to go all the way down to the mamish, to the tangibility of our physical world, and give it back to God and change it and make it an expression of God, making this whole world God's home, which is why, in essence, we're all here. All right, so that's the first concept. So the Rebbe now wants to prove this to us, meaning, we're believers. We got it. We accept it. We know it. Awesome. Great. Let's move on. Sarah says, wait a minute. What I'm saying, I want you to really understand it. I want to prove it very foundationally. So the Rebbe is now going to give us two different rationales, how we can understand the uniqueness of the Jewish soul. And again, what's my question? Well, everything's godliness. If it was godliness, it wouldn't be. Right. Everything's godliness. The soul is a piece of God, not creator. Only God's the creator, but not creation either. Quasi-creator, quasi-creation. That's the soul, which is the definitive core of every Jew. So when we look at ourselves and we think, yeah, we're like, whatever, regular, small, unimportant. It's a fake out. And somehow we got fooled. Don't get fooled by the fake out. Now, sometimes I think this, like, I don't know, if I'm in a place like an airport, there's all these people running around and doing all these things, and I'm just a little nobody sitting waiting for my plane. But that's not true. I'm a Jew. A Jew is the point and purpose of it all. A Jew is this piece of God in this world. That's who we always are. If the world recognizes it or not, if we recognize it or not, that is the Jew. A soul, a piece of God sent to this world to make a difference. So now we're going to read the first of the two rationales, proving this concept. And of course, the proof is not just to prove it, but really to more deeply understand it. So in both of the rationales, we're going to be contrasting the soul to everything else in creation. In the first rationale, we speak about the idea of breath, how the soul is blown as versus the rest of creation that's spoken. In the second rationale, we speak of the soul as from God's thoughts, as versus the rest of creation from God's speech. So in both rationales, we're looking at the soul in her specialness, blown or thought, as versus the rest of creation, which is consistently spoken. As we know, it says in Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avos, Ba'asara ma'amaros nivra ha'olam. The world was created with 10 creative utterances, with God's speech. God started speaking those words 5,786 years ago, and he's still saying them. And as he constantly re-speaks again and again and again, this is how the world continues to exist until this very, very second, literally. So how can I say it's a piece of God? I mean, that sounds like, oh my gosh. Well, of course, it's a quote. It's from Eov, it's from Job, but still, how do we say it? Well, it's written, so to speak, because look what's written about the soul. Vayifach ba'apav nishmas chayim. And he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. This is, of course, from the scriptures, from the verses, talking about the creation of Adam in Genesis. Vayifach ba'apav nishmas chayim. And he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. God is blowing into the first man, Adam Harishon, Adam, a soul. He's not giving him the soul. He's not speaking into him the soul. He's blowing into him the soul. You could say, all right, well, I guess Adam is prototype man, so that means all of our souls are blown into us, but maybe not. I mean, he was the first. He was special. He was different. Well, we say in our prayers, Va'ata nafachta bi, right? We say this every day in the morning blessings. In Elkai Neshama. Va'ata nafachta bi. And you blew her into me, right? Every day, every Jew, in the morning. One of the first things we say to God is talking about our soul, how our soul, my soul, your soul, every single Jew's soul is blown into us. So we had here two proofs. The first proof from the verses itself, from scriptures, from Torah, from Bereshit, is saying God blew the soul into Adam Harishon. And then, okay, well, that was him, prototype man, but him, no. We say this every day in our prayers. The first part of our prayers are the blessings we're supposed to say right away in the morning. And within those blessings, one of the first things we say is a paragraph starting off, Elokai neshama shenasata bi Tairahi. God, the soul you gave me, she is pure. Actually, it used to be originally This was the first thing people would say when they wake up. Today, we say the Modeh Ani prayer instead, because we're not at a holy level to start with this passage. But in more ancient times, they actually started with this passage. It's very foundational, talking about God giving us our soul. And what do we say when we're talking about God giving us our soul? Atanafachtabi. You blew the soul into me, not just into Adam, into me. So we can say, okay, cool, I get it. The Alter Rebbe proved that pretty conclusively. That's pretty solid. So what? Who cares? So now the Alter Rebbe brings a quotation from the Zohar, from the most foundational work of the inner dimension of Torah, who explains why do we care? As it says in Zohar, one who blows from his insides, meaning breath is expressing, taking something very inward and bringing it out. And of course, the contrast point would be to speech, because everything else in the world was spoken into being. With the 10 creative utterances, God created and is creating constantly all of existence. He's talking and talking and talking into existence. But the soul, he blows into existence. So breath versus speech, inward versus a more external process. As of course we know, because if you're blowing balloons for a party, there's only so many balloons you're going to blow before you run out and look for a little gizmo or machine or something that's going to do this for you. But we can talk all day, no problem. Why? Because talking is breath, but it's not inward breath. So it's not draining me of my energies the same way. But when I'm blowing, it's from my very inwards. And therefore, I can't keep it up so long. So this proof, this whole rationale, one, a quotation from Torah, from the scriptures, God blowing into Adam the soul. Two, a quotation from our prayers. God, you blew the soul into me. And three, the quotation from the Zohar, foundational work of the inner dimension of Torah, blowing means from the inside. This is very solid, very simple, very straightforward, very conclusive. And that's what we gain from this first rationale. The soul is different than the rest of creation, because the rest of creation was spoken and the soul is blown. Now, what do I gain from this? What I'm gaining is the soul comes from the inner reality of God. And that's very special and very significant. But obviously we're not done, because if we were done, we wouldn't need two rationales. We'd only need one. But now we're going to learn a second rationale on why or how or what are we saying here by saying the soul is a piece of God above, literally, which has a different or even more strong conclusion than this first one. Meaning they, in a sense, both have an advantage. Like, why do we need two? Well, the first one's very straightforward, very simple, very clear. The second one, it's not as straightforward as the first in terms of the proving, in terms of the supports. The first one, when I'm talking about blowing, I come away with the conclusion that the soul is from the inner reality of God, which is very, very significant. By the second one, what we're about to do, I come out with an even stronger conclusion. I'm going to walk away now with something even stronger than this first concept, which is definitely very special and very strong, and I get it. My soul is not like the rest of creation. Therefore, the Jew is not like the rest of creation. As I said, we're a fake out. We're not like creation. All of creation was spoken. We were blown. All of creation is from God's external reality, speech. We're from God's inner reality, breath. Now, when you speak, and we'll discuss this soon a little more, but just to understand this point we're trying to make here, speech is very outward bound. Speech, Hasidus defines as a revelation to something else. Breath is already a much more inner expression. It's not outward revelation. And how much more so when we go into the second rationale, where we're not saying breath versus speech, we're saying thought versus speech. The neshama, the soul, was blown into us, and the soul comes from God's thoughts. The neshama was blown, the rest of the world is created through speech. The soul is from God's thoughts. The rest of the world, of course, is from God's speech. Now, again, speech, thought, it's all from God, true. But as I just said, speech is when I want to express outwardly. Thought is when I want to express inwardly. Meaning both speech and thought are tools of revelation. Speech is external, outward bound revelation, and thought is self-revelation. It's inward revelation. So if the world is created by speech and the soul comes from God's thought, what we're saying is the soul has a completely different relationship to God than all of creation. All of creation is outward and the soul is inward. And when we learn this inside, as we're going to do right now, we'll see how inward the soul truly is. Because to say just inward, I don't need this whole second rationale. I already got that from the blowing. So we're saying something even more than inward. Because inward, I already know. I want to get something more. In general, we understand, again, creation is from speech. And of course, this is something we will discuss later at length in Tanya, chapter 20, 21, 22, the significance of this world being through speech and understanding that in general, we, because we're in God's image, have three modalities, three options. God's three options, which then become my three options, are expression through thought, speech, or action. And God could have used any of the three for creation. He could have used action, but that would have made a world very separate from him, so to speak. Obviously, nothing separate from him, but definitely feeling very separate from him. He could have created a world from thought, which would have been so inward, but then not so substantial as actually a world as a thing, because thought is really inward bound itself. So God chose to create everything but the soul through speech, to have this balance of, on one hand, really close, really expression of self, but on the other hand, outward expression of self. So therefore, there is some facade, illusion of existence outside of God's reality. Part of God's reality, but seemingly out of God's reality. That's the world. But that's not the soul. The soul doesn't have those illusions because the soul comes from thought. We're told that on every Sabbath, every Shabbos, God ascends to connect to the world not through speech, as he does all week long, but through thought. And Mashiach, we have the complete revelation of Mashiach, God will be energizing the world not through speech and not even through thought, through his subconscious thoughts. That's how close, that's how one the world will be with God by Mashiach. But now, there's that one thing in creation that already is so one with God, it's his thoughts, and that's the soul. The definitive quality of every single Jew. What makes us a Jew? We are from not God's speech. That's everything else in creation. It's a little external, outward bound. We're from God's thoughts. That's how close we are to him. So let's read this inside. Kach al derech mashal, so too, so to speak. Nishmas Yisrael alu b'machshava. The souls of the Jews came up in God's thoughts. Kidirsiv. Now, how am I going to prove it? And this is where I'm saying is a difference between the first rationale and the second. The first rationale we said was very straight. A quotation about Adam getting his soul blown. A quotation about our souls blown into us. The explanation of the Zohar, why that's significant. Three very straightforward things leading to a very basic conclusion. The soul is blown. It is from God's inner dimension. Here, as I said, we want to say something even stronger. That's why it's worth saying something else after we already went through the whole blowing concept. We're going to come with an even stronger conclusion. But the proofs is not as straight, because what we want to prove is that the souls come from God's thoughts. Right? That's what we've been talking about. The souls come from God's thoughts. But guess what? There's no quote that says that. Obviously, if there was, the Alter Rebbe would use it. It would be very simple. But there isn't. So we can't. This is no creative, let me make up quotations. You'll never check me. No. This is only what's really there. And there's no quotation that says that the soul is from God's thoughts. So where's Alter Rebbe coming from? Where is he saying the soul is from God's thoughts? Nowhere in all of scriptures and all of Tanakh does it say that. True. It does not say that. But it says something else very powerful. It says that we the Jews, the souls, are God's child. And the child comes from the brain of the Father. So if the soul is the child of God and a child comes from the brain of the Father, every soul comes from the brain, from the thought processes of God. As the Alter Rebbe says, right? He says, Nishmas Yisrael Ola b'machshava, the souls came up in God's thoughts. Well, prove that to me. Kidduchsiv, as is written, B'ni l'chayri Yisrael, my son, my firstborn, Israel. And another famous verse, you are sons, you are children to God your Father. So again, I'm saying, fact, bottom line, the souls come from God's thoughts, and I'm proving it with two quotations, and actually, of course, are more, but two quotations stating that we are God's child. So the Alter Rebbe goes on now to explain how does this equal that. So the Rebbe says, Perush, meaning to say, just as the child, as a son, comes from the brain of the father. It's very interesting because nowadays in science, like when the Alter Rebbe wrote this, okay, everyone accept this, but then as we learn a little more, we're like, what do you mean the child comes from the brain of the father? What's the brain of the father have to do with the conception of a child? But it's interesting because actually nowadays they know there is a gland that's in the brain of the father, a pituitary gland that releases a secretion, which actually is the start of what's going to be the sperm that's going to ultimately fertilize the egg and be that child. So it starts in the brain of the father. So just as the child comes from the brain of the father, kach kiviyachol, so to speak, nishmos kol ish Yisrael nimshacha, the soul of every Jew, every Jewish person is drawn from the thoughts, from the wisdom of God. So the Rebbe says, a child comes from the brain of the father. We are the children of God. If the child comes from the brain of the father, and we are the children of God, right? The child to the father, the soul, the Jew to God. So the child comes from the brain of the father. We are the children of God. So that means where do we come from? We must come from the brain, the thoughts of God himself. I'll do that one more time if that wasn't clear. This is at those moments where I wish I had a blackboard. The relationship, the child comes from the brain of the father. Every Jew is God's child. That we proved, right? My son, my firstborn Israel, you are children to God your Father. The child comes from the brain of the father. The Jew comes then from the brain of God. So I can't prove we come from his brain, but I can prove we're his child. So if I know the child comes from the brain of the father, so the soul of the Jew comes from the brain, from the thoughts of God himself. Very powerful. But we're not done. It's more powerful than you can imagine. Because basically, so what? Well, it's so special. It's so inward. It's not God's speech like the rest of creation. It's God's thoughts. I already know it's more inward than the rest of creation. Alter Rebbe, you're not saying anything new, and the first proof was stronger. Meaning the first proof, it was just straight, quote, quote, as clearly written as you'd ever want. The rest of the world is speech. I know that. With 10 utterances, God is creating. The soul is blown. I know that. And he blew in his nostrils a soul of life, and you blow into me the soul. What's the difference between blown and speech? Blown is inward. We come from the inner dimension of God. The rest of the world comes from an external dimension of God. So if I'm saying the same thing again, I didn't gain anything. And as I'm saying, the first proof was a lot straighter than this one. So here I also have to make that leap of like, I'm the child, and the child comes from the brain of the father. So therefore, if I'm God's child, I come from the brain of God, which means I'm inward and the rest of the world is external. I already know that from the first proof. So what am I adding? So the Rebbe goes on to say, no, we're adding here. We're adding something really big. The Ihu Hakim. That God is Chachma. He is his seminal wisdom. The Lo B'Chachma Yediyah. But not with a wisdom that's known. Not with the wisdom that the rest of the world knows when they think of the brain and the thoughts and the wisdom. What's the difference? Elohu v'chachmaso echad. The Rebbe here is bringing you quotations from the Zohar. The last quotation was from the introduction of the Zohar. So this is very foundational. This is right in the introduction of the Zohar. It's 3 quotes here, 3 phrases. The Ihu Chakim, God is the Ihu, it's Aramaic. This is from the Zohar. God is Chakim. Chakim, like the Hebrew Chachma. God is Chachma. God is wisdom. God is thought. God is seminal wisdom. But not the wisdom that you know of, not the wisdom that is known. Meaning, God's wisdom isn't like our wisdom. Well, yeah, he's a lot smarter. He's infinitely smart. I'm very finite in my brains. No, that's just a quantitative difference. This is something experientially different. What's the difference? Hu v'chachmaso echad. God and his chachma, his wisdom, is one. And we have nothing like that in all of our experience to compare it to. In general, if we would look at any other religion, go back to pagans, mythology, wherever you want to look at, every man-made religion basically takes, generally their best. So some religions and belief systems, it's not only the good traits, but in any case, we'll say the best qualities of man and make it a lot bigger and call that God. So from most pagan to most, so to speak, sophisticated religion, theology, it's all taking the human understanding and amplifying it a lot, and we call that God. But that's not Judaism. Because Judaism, unlike every other pseudo-religion out there, so to speak, Judaism comes from God. Which by definition means God's not like us. God's not a bigger, better, shinier model of man. God's God. And what we're saying here in this piece of Zohar is one of course, many essence differences that man's not going to dream up because we can't even think like this. What are we saying? God is not like us because God and his thoughts are one. We are not one with our thoughts. I'm a human. I possess the faculty of thinking, and I think thoughts. 3 distinct separate things. The person, his ability to think, and the thoughts he thinks, which plays out on so many levels. On a very simple level, you could think one thing and do something else, right? Like we might say a hypocrite, or you have a belief system and you don't live by it, right? You tell yourself in your thought, you're all focused on only eating healthy and all the benefits and it's so clear in your brain, but somehow, hand, mouth, eye coordination, you're just doing something very different. How could you do that? You know it so clearly. What does that have to do with anything, right? Since when does knowledge have to do with what I do? I know and I do 2 totally separate things, because my knowledge isn't me. I'm a person. And I have a faculty of thought. And God forbid, sometimes things happen to a person's faculty of thought, right? Things could degenerate over age or trauma or accidents or illness. The person could still exist and live as a person, even if something happened to their power of thought, because the power of thought isn't them. And let alone the thoughts you think. As I'm saying, you could think thoughts that you don't believe in at all. You could think thoughts and believe in them, but live a very different life than those beliefs. There's me, there's my power of thinking, and there's the thoughts I think. And by God, all of that is one. What does that mean? It's hard for us to say what does that mean because we can't fathom what that means. It's just like the most foundational coordinates of all existence is time and space. You don't have to be a theologian to figure that out. Any one of you could have figured that out on your own. The most foundational coordinates of all of our existence is time and space. And God is out of that box of time and space. What does that mean? I could talk about it. Do I really get it on the inside? Of course not. How can I get on the inside something that doesn't work the way we or anything we've ever experienced worked? So similarly here. So we might not get it, but we can understand the enormous significance in our discussion. Because we are saying the soul, God's child, comes from the thoughts of God, like a child comes from the brain, the thoughts of the Father. And therefore what? And therefore the soul and God are one. Why is the soul one with God? Because it comes from the thoughts of God. Because God and his thoughts are one. I think of it like, algebra. If A equals B and A equals C, then B equals C, right? Again, to my blackboard that's not here. If God is one with his thoughts, if the soul comes from those thoughts, then God and the soul are one. God is one with his thoughts. The soul is one with those thoughts. God and the soul are one. So this is a tremendous intensification of the concept that we got from the blowing model. So if we look at the structure of this chapter, first we said, we defined the soul, a piece of God, literally. We said, what does that mean? Well, the rest of the world is godliness. The soul's God. The rest of the world is creation. The soul's not creator, but not exactly creation either. What's the difference? Well, flowing. The rest of the world is spoken, more external, outward. I could talk and talk and talk. Doesn't drain me because it's an external energy, external breath. Blowing, that's an inner breath. Oh, that drains me because it's really coming from the inside. So the soul comes from the inner dimension of God, as well as the rest of the world external. Right? So God versus godliness, inner breath versus external speech. But now we're saying the soul coming from the thoughts of God, from the chachma, the wisdom of God, is absolutely one with him. So we started this thought model based on two proofs, two verses, saying we're God's child. And the Alter Rebbe said, well, just as a child comes from the brain of the father, the soul comes from the brain, the thoughts of God. So child's relationship to father, soul's relationship to God. Now we're saying a lot deeper than that. Because the child coming from the brain of the father does not make the child one with the father. Because the father's not one with his brain. The father's not one with his thoughts. The father possesses the brain faculty, possesses the thoughts, but he's not one with them. Only by God is it different that his thoughts are him. So the relationship of the soul to God in that child-father model is much, much more extreme, the soul to God, the oneness, than a child to a father. A child comes from the thoughts, comes from the brain of the father, but is not one with the father. The soul coming from the thoughts of God, that means the soul is one with God. So we're talking about, as Sarah said in the beginning, how special we are, that we're God's child. As the Baal Shem Tov says, every Jew is God's only child. The Baal Shem Tov says every Jew is God's only child, that, so to speak, like a parent that waited their entire life for a child. That's the relationship of this Jew, any Jew, every Jew, and God. And now we're saying, and look what that means. It's not only a love bond, it's one. Every one of us, however sometimes insignificant we think we are, meaningless we think we are, small we think we are, every one of us, every single Jew, our soul is absolutely one with God. And that power, no matter what we ever do with that power is the core of every single one of us. The Alter Rebbe proved this concept with quotations from the Zohar. He, God, is chachma, is seminal wisdom, but not with the wisdom that's known. What's the difference? Again, quotation from the introduction to the Zohar. This is so important. This is in the introduction, one of the most original, foundational, first concepts. God and his wisdom are one. So this is very strongly proven from the inner dimension of Torah. Now the Alter Rebbe adds, and this same concept is also in the revealed Torah, because Maimonides says the same thing. Now, obviously, Maimonides' words are not going to be the words of the Zohar, Zohar expresses the inner dimension of Torah, the soul of Torah. Maimonides is expressing the outer dimension of Torah, the revealed dimension of Torah, the body of Torah. But the content of what they're saying is the same. As we're now going to read, Harambam, and as Maimonides writes, Shuamada v'yodea v'yodua. The Rebbe quotes 2/3 of the quote. I finished it off. The Rebbe says, etc. Shuamada v'yodea. God is the ability to know. God is the knower. What the Rebbe doesn't conclude is the third part, which isn't as relevant here. And God is that which is known. The ability to know, like we would say our brain, the knower, like us, and the knowledge, the thoughts in the brain of the person. Again, by us, there's a person who possesses a brain that processes information, and by God, the knower, the processing of that, and the knowledge is all one. So the inner dimension of Torah, he and his seminal wisdom are one. Maimonides, the revealed Torah, hu amada, hu yodea, hu yadua. He, who, if you can hear it in the Hebrew, we're repeating the same word again and again. He is the mada, the ability to know. Hu hayodea. He is the knower. He is the knowledge. Same he, the ability to know, the knower and the knowledge, it's all the same he, God. So inner and outer dimension of Torah, God and his thoughts are one. And therefore we are one with God. Before I do anything good, before I do anything good or mundane or worse than that, never takes away who I am. I am a godly soul. A godly soul is not only a peace, it's not only inward. The godly soul is literally one with God. And that is the beginning of chapter 2 of Tanya.
recently. So it was very, very interesting. It was like a concert and he was telling his story, but I was so grateful. My son, before the concert, he said, that's the only reason why I bought my expensive keyboard, just to play tonight in Chabad. So
Wow. Wow.
I was so proud. I was so proud. So it was wonderful Shabbos overall.
Nachas Shabbos. Real Nachas Shabbos.
Yes.
Healthy mommy, healthy baby.
Yes, Baruch Hashem. Yeah.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. You should continue to have that nachas. Healthy children, healthy grandchildren, all together serving Hashem.
Thank you. Amen.
Wow. Beautiful. Anyone else? Anyone else have something they would like to thank God for? Okay, so let's do from the Torah portion of this week by Yetzei. So just a brief excerpt. The Rebbe says the most timely thing in our generation and in this time is the redemption. It's the most timely thing. You want to live with the times? The most timely thing is Mashiach. As we've spoken many, many times, that now everything is finished, all matters have been completed, and we only need to accept Melech HaMashiach. The only thing waiting is for us to truly accept King Mashiach, because everything else, long done. Thank you so much for joining, and the Mazel Tov should continue. So beautiful what Menucha shared with us. The Mazel Tov should continue for everyone.
Amen.
Thank
Amen.
you
Thank
so
you.
much.